My ex-husband's dying wish was a playlist of our old songs, so I sent him one filled with everything he broke. 15 years. That's how long I'd spent building these walls, brick by painstaking brick of routine and an almost aggressive silence, to keep the past, and specifically Mark Ellis, out. My small apartment wasn't just a home, it was a meticulously curated fortress against memory, every object in its place, a bulwark against the chaos he'd represented. So, when the old landline shrilled on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday afternoon, a sound so alien in my quiet life it felt like a grenade pin being pulled, I knew. Before I even lifted the receiver, a cold premonition prickled my skin, the past had found a battering ram. Sarah Jenkins? A young woman's voice, hesitant, threaded with a nervousness that set my own teeth on edge. Speaking. My own voice was flatter than I intended, a practiced neutrality. My name is Laura. I'm a hospice nurse. At St. Jude's. The name, St. Jude's, landed like a stone in a still pond. Mark. It had to be. His sister, Clara, had mentioned his health struggles in a Christmas card years ago, information I'd mentally shredded and discarded. It's about Mark Ellis, she confirmed, her voice softening. He doesn't have long, Mrs. Jenkins. Sarah. The switch to my first name felt like an unearned intimacy, a trespass. He has a final request. A final request. The words seemed to suck the air from my tidy kitchen. I glanced at the spice rack, its labels perfectly aligned, at the single, unchipped teacup beside the sink. Order. Control. The life I had built from the shards of the one he'd shattered. And now, from the precipice of his own oblivion, he wanted something? The nerve of the man. A torrent of no's screamed in my head, a flat, unequivocal, liberating refusal. No to him, no to his ghosts, no to this grotesque parody of sentiment after all these years. And what, I heard myself ask, my voice emerging as a calm, detached query that belied the storm within, might that be? There was a small, breathy pause on the other end. He wants you to make him a playlist, Sarah. Of your old songs. The ones you two shared. Our old songs? The ones he'd recalibrated as anthems of my naivety, theme tunes to my unraveling? The request was so audacious, so typically Mark in its casual disregard for the wreckage he'd left behind, that a laugh, sharp and humorless, almost escaped me. My mind flashed to specific, searing vignettes, his wedding ring on a motel nightstand beside a bottle of cheap perfume, his voice, flat and indifferent, saying, I just don't love you anymore, Sarah. The ghosts he now summoned weren't gentle specters, they were biting, accusatory phantoms. I see, I said, the two words like chips of ice. He said it's important, Laura pressed, her earnestness grating. He wants to hear them one last time. One last time. One last demand. One last performance from the woman whose life he'd edited into a tragedy. A different kind of coldness, sharp and surprisingly energizing, coiled in my stomach. A smile, thin and dangerous, touched my lips. Tell Mr. Ellis, I said, savoring the formal address, yes. I'll make his playlist. I hung up before she could utter another syllable, the click of the phone echoing in the sudden, charged silence of my fortress. Oh, I'd make him a playlist, all right. He wanted our songs. He'd get every last broken, jagged, tear-stained note. He'd get the full, unexpurgated soundtrack of everything he broke. The next morning, my apartment, usually a sanctuary of calm, felt charged, restless. Sunlight, normally a welcome guest, sliced through the blinds, illuminating dust motes dancing with a manic energy I now shared. The task lay before me, to excavate the ruins of us, piece by painstaking piece, song by agonizing song. Mark wanted a playlist, I would give him an autopsy. I started in the spare room, the one I optimistically called a study but which had become a mausoleum of forgotten hobbies and boxed-up history. Stacked in a corner, beneath a moth-eaten blanket, were the LPs and CDs, our LPs and CDs. His jazz affections, my folk leanings, the pop compromises we'd made. Each spine, a tiny, silent testament. My fingers, usually so steady when cataloging library books, trembled slightly as I pulled out the first dusty sleeve. Billie Holiday. He'd loved her voice, that bruised, resilient sound. I remembered him playing Gloomy Sunday on repeat the week his mother died, the melody a shroud he'd wrapped himself in. For a moment, an unexpected sliver of something akin to empathy, sharp as a paper cut, pierced through my resolve. I pushed it away. This wasn't about her. This was about us. The first track for Mark's Requiem, as I'd mentally titled it, was easy. A searing guitar solo from an obscure blues band we'd seen in a dive bar the night I found lipstick on his collar, not my shade. The memory flared, vivid and hot, the crowded bar, the sticky floor, his too quick denial, the knot of nausea in my gut. Click. Added to playlist. Next, a cheerful, upbeat pop song, the one playing on the car radio when he'd casually mentioned he was thinking about seeing other people as if discussing the weather. The dissonance of the melody against the memory was almost physically painful. Click. Then, I found it. Tucked between a Santana album and something by the Carpenters I didn't even remember owning. A mixtape. Cassette. The label, in his familiar slanted hand, simply read, "For Sarah." Year 1. My breath caught. Year 1. Before the grand betrayals, before the slow erosion of trust, before the silence had grown louder than any song. I hadn't seen it in probably 20 years. I didn't own a cassette player anymore. Of course, I didn't. Who did? But I remembered some of those songs. One in particular. A gentle acoustic track by a singer-songwriter whose name I'd long forgotten. He'd played it for me on a rainy Sunday, our legs tangled on the threadbare couch of our first tiny apartment, the world outside a gray blur, the world inside just us. Warmth, unbidden and unwelcome, bloomed in my chest, a traitorous sensation. My finger hovered over the mental delete button for that memory, for that song from this bitter compilation. It didn't fit the narrative I was crafting, the one where he was the unequivocal villain and I, the righteous, wounded party. This song, this memory, was an anomaly, a dissonance in my carefully constructed symphony of pain. The unease wasn't just about the past, it was about the present, about the uncomfortable truth that memory, even vengeful memory, rarely comes in neat, clean lines. Night fell like a dropped curtain, and my small apartment, usually a bastion of curated silence, was now cacophonous with the uninvited ghosts of songs. I'd moved from the study to the living room, surrounded by a battlefield of jewel cases and liner notes. The initial momentum of righteous fury had waned, replaced by a dull throb behind my temples and an exhaustion that settled deeper than bone. The playlist on my laptop screen was a grotesque patchwork. A ballad he'd once sung to me, its lyrics now dripping with insincere sentiment, sat next to a thrash metal track I'd found on a compilation of his, one I imagined was the soundtrack to his deceit. Each edition felt less like a carefully placed barb and more like exhuming another piece of myself I'd bought safely interred. My younger self, earnest and hopeful, stared back at me from the memory of a summer festival, him laughing, swinging me around to a band whose name I couldn't recall, only the dizzying, naive joy. I'd almost added that song, the joyful one, to the Ruins playlist out of sheer perversity, a testament to how high we'd flown before the crash. But my finger had paused over the add button. Some ruins, it seemed, were still too sacred to desecrate, even in the name of posthumous revenge. Then, a memory, unbidden and unwelcome as a tax audit, surfaced. A difficult period, about 5 years into the marriage. Mark had lost his job, a dream job he'd poured his soul into. I remembered his silence then, a heavy, suffocating blanket over our home. I'd seen it as brooding, another of his emotional withdrawals, another failure to communicate. I had responded with brisk, impatient efficiency, focusing on bills and job applications, my sympathy muted by my own rising panic and a growing resentment that I always had to be the strong one. Tonight, for the first time in decades, I saw not a sullen man, but a terrified one. A man whose confidence had been shattered, looking to me for something I hadn't known how to give, or perhaps hadn't been willing to. The realization was a small, cold stone in my gut. Was that his fault? Or mine? Or just ours? The question, sharp and unwelcome, snagged on the edges of my carefully constructed narrative of blame. I scrolled through the songs I'd already chosen. That blistering anthem of betrayal by a woman scorned, did it tell the whole story? Or just the chapter I'd underlined in red ink? The satisfaction I'd felt in choosing it earlier now tasted metallic, like old blood. This painstaking excavation wasn't making me feel powerful. It was making me feel hollowed out. As if by chipping away at him, I was also, inevitably, eroding the foundations of what had once, however briefly, been real for me. The ghosts weren't just his, they were mine too, and they were demanding a more complicated accounting. The weight of accumulated yesterdays pressed down, heavy as unshed tears. For 2 days, I avoided the living room, that curated battlefield of sound and memory. I found myself taking long, aimless walks through my neighborhood, streets I'd traversed countless times without truly seeing. Now, I noticed the chipped paint on a forgotten porch swing, the stubborn insistence of a dandelion pushing through a sidewalk crack, small, silent dramas of endurance. My own internal landscape felt similarly cracked, weeds of unwelcome emotion pushing through the concrete of my resolve. One afternoon, a sharp, unexpected scent of honeysuckle, cloyingly sweet, ambushed me from an overgrown alley. It wasn't a scent I associated with Mark, not directly. But it was the exact perfume my mother had worn, the scent that clung to her comforting bulk when I was a girl, heartbroken over some trivial teenage slight. And in that moment, a memory, not of Mark, but of me, 16, tear-stained, railing against the unfairness of a boy who hadn't called, unspooled with brutal clarity. My mother hadn't offered solutions, hadn't condemned the boy. She'd just held me, smelling of honeysuckle and quiet strength, and let me cry until the hurt was a dull ache instead of a tearing wound. I stopped, mid-stride, on a busy sidewalk. The memory was so vivid, so intensely felt, that it was a physical blow. My carefully constructed anger at Mark, my narrative of his singular, monstrous betrayal, suddenly felt incomplete. Simplistic. He had been cruel, yes. Undeniably. But had I, in the long, bitter aftermath, forgotten the complexities? Had I, in nursing my own wounds, neglected to acknowledge any tenderness that might have existed before the rot set in? Or any part one might have played in the silences that grew between us like poisonous vines? The honeysuckle memory, so gentle, so unrelated to Mark's specific sins, had somehow acted as a solvent, dissolving a small, hard layer of my bitterness. Later that evening, back in my apartment, the pile of CDs seemed less like an arsenal and more like a box of unexploded ordnance, dangerous to us all. I sat before the nascent playlist. There was one track, a furious, screaming rock anthem I'd selected to represent the rage of his final, devastating betrayal. It had felt perfect a few days ago. Now, it felt loud. Performative. My hand, moving almost of its own accord, deleted it. I stared at the empty slot for a long time. Then, slowly, hesitantly, I typed in the name of a different song. An old blues track, sung by a woman whose voice was pure gravel and heartache, a song about love lost not in a blaze of fury, but in a slow, inevitable dimming of the light. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't forgiveness. It was just a different key. A truer one, perhaps. The room felt a little quieter after that, the ghosts a little less demanding. The act of changing that one song, swapping raw fury for a bruised resignation, had subtly altered the entire alchemy of the project. It was no longer a straightforward demolition. Now, sifting through the remaining candidates for Mark's playlist felt less like arming myself and more like archaeology. I was unearthing a lost civilization, ours, with all its curious rituals, its broken pottery, its faded glories, and its undeniable, pervasive dust. Some choices remained sharp-edged with the glass of betrayal. The cheerful 60s pop song that had been playing when he confessed his first affair, that stayed. Its bright, unblemished surface was a perfect, cruel counterpoint to the memory. But other additions surprised me. A live recording of a jazz piece, messy and improvised, full of breath and flawed notes, that we'd stumbled upon in a smoky New Orleans club on a rare, spontaneous vacation. We'd argued that night, I remembered, something about money, or my insecurity. But listening to it now, I heard not the argument, but the vibrant, imperfect thrum of two people trying, however clumsily, to make music together. I added it, not as an accusation, but as evidence. Of what, I wasn't entirely sure. Perhaps just evidence that things are rarely as simple as we paint them in the stark colors of hindsight. I found myself wondering, as I dragged and dropped tracks into a digital folder, what Mark truly expected. Did he anticipate a sentimental journey? Absolution on a silver disc? Or was this, too, one of his more passive-aggressive maneuvers, a way to force a final reckoning he was too cowardly to initiate himself when he was well? The questions hung in the air, unanswerable. And I realized, with a startling sense of clarity, that his motives, his expectations, were no longer the axis around which my world tilted. This careful, painful curation, it had become about my understanding, my final word to the past, not just to him. The sun was setting, casting long, melancholic shadows across my living room floor, when I looked at the assembled tracks. 22 songs. An odd number. A lifetime condensed into an hour and a half of melody and memory. It wasn't an indictment anymore, not entirely. Nor was it a love letter. It was an elegy. A complex, bittersweet acknowledgement of something that had lived, breathed, soared, and ultimately, catastrophically, failed. Now, the decision. Option A, the full, unvarnished truth. Send this complex, messy archive. Let him hear the echoes of joy alongside the deafening crash of its end. Option B, the Kinder edit. Pare it down to a handful of more neutral, melancholic tracks, songs about time, loss, the turning of seasons. Less personal, less exposing. Option C, for myself alone. Close the folder. Archive it on my hard drive. The act of making it had been the point. He didn't need to be the final audience. I sat there for a long time, the cursor blinking. The weight of 15 years of bitterness, of carefully guarded hurt, seemed to be in my fingertips. And then, I thought of that honeysuckle scent, of my mother's quiet strength, of the unexpected sorrow for the young, hopeful man Mark had once been, the man I had once loved. The anger, so long my most familiar companion, felt distant, like a receding tide. I created a new playlist. Just 5 songs. The gentle acoustic track from our first year. The messy jazz from New Orleans. A quiet folk song about enduring change that we'd both, improbably, liked. The blues track about light dimming slowly. And finally, a simple piano piece, no lyrics, just a spare, haunting melody that spoke of goodbyes without assigning blame. I typed a note, briefer than a breath, Mark, I made you a playlist. Sarah. No venom. No accusations. No demand for a response. I hit send on the email, his hospice nurse had provided the address. And then I closed the laptop. A profound weariness washed over me, but it wasn't the crushing fatigue of before. It was the weariness of a long journey completed. Beneath it, a strange, fragile lightness fluttered. I had walked through the fire of memory, and if I wasn't entirely unscathed, I was, at least, still standing. And perhaps, for the first time, truly ready to walk away from the ashes. The send button, once clicked, felt like a door closing softly, not slammed, but latched with a quiet finality. I hadn't expected trumpets or a celestial choir. I hadn't expected anything at all, and that, I realized, was the gift I'd inadvertently given myself. The frantic need for validation, for Mark to understand the depth of his transgressions or the enormity of my pain, had dissipated, leaving behind a clean, quiet space in my mind. Days folded into a week. I didn't check my email obsessively. I didn't jump when the phone rang. The hospice nurse didn't call with a report on his reaction, and I didn't seek one out. The silence from his end was absolute, but it no longer felt like a weapon aimed at me, or a void I needed to fill with my own remembered anger. It was just silence. The natural state of things when a conversation, however one-sided and decades late, had finally run its course. One morning, I found myself standing by my living room window, a place I'd often stood years ago, watching for Mark's car, a knot of anxiety or anticipation twisting in my gut. Today, there was no knot. I watched a pair of blue jays bickering over a crust of bread on the fire escape, their squawks sharp and undignified, and I smiled. A small, genuine smile that reached my eyes. I hadn't smiled much lately, not truly. I poured myself a cup of coffee, just one, and savored the bitter, uncomplicated taste. The apartment felt different. The objects Mark and I had once shared, a few old books on a high shelf, a slightly chipped ceramic vase he'd gifted me in what felt like another lifetime, no longer seemed to vibrate with accusation or sorrow. They were just things now, remnants of a story that had reached its final page, at least for me. The weight I hadn't realized I was carrying, the constant internal monologue of grievance and regret, had lightened considerably. It wasn't that the memories were gone, or the pain entirely erased. It was more that they had settled, like sediment in a still pond, leaving the water above surprisingly clear. I picked up a travel brochure that had come in the mail, a brightly colored invitation to a place with mountains and clear, cold rivers, somewhere I'd always vaguely wanted to go but had never found the time, or perhaps the courage. I didn't make any plans. I just looked at the pictures, at the expanse of an unfamiliar sky, and felt not the familiar tug of what-ifs concerning Mark, but a new, quiet hum of what next, for myself. The playlist, the one I'd actually sent, remained a private coda between whatever was left of him and whatever was newly formed in me. I didn't need to know if he'd listened. I didn't need his apology, or his understanding. The symphony of our ruins had, in its painstaking, agonizing composition, finally played itself out, not for him, but for me. And in the silence that followed, I could, at last, begin to hear my own music.